In a library in Manchester, England, there is a scrap of papyrus roughly the size of a credit card, torn on every edge. It has writing on both sides, which means it was never a scroll. It was a page, out of a book, one of the oldest books anyone has ever found, and the few words still legible on it are a conversation. A provincial governor is questioning a prisoner. The prisoner says he came to bear witness to the truth, and the governor answers with 3 words that people have been repeating for 19 centuries. What is truth? That fragment comes from a book unlike anything else in the Bible, a book with no parables in it, not one. No exorcisms, no birth story, no temptation in the wilderness, no transfiguration, no sweating blood in a garden. No moment where he takes bread at the last meal and says, "This is my body." That scene, the one every church repeats weekly, this book leaves it out. And yet, this is the book that gave us the single most quoted sentence in human history. The one on the poster board at the football game. It is the book that opens not with a manger or a genealogy, but with a poem about the beginning of everything. It is the only gospel that stops in the middle, looks straight at you, and tells you exactly why it was written and what it wants from you. And it is the only gospel that ends twice. This is the Gospel of John, and almost nobody reads it the way it was built to be read. We read it in pieces. A verse for a wedding, a verse for a funeral, chapter 3 at the door with a tract. But it is not a collection. It is a designed argument with a hinge in the middle and a stated purpose near the end. So here is what this video does. We read it whole, front to back, every movement, in order, the way the man who assembled it laid it out. And we do it honestly, including the 2 famous passages that the earliest copies of this book do not actually contain. Start where it starts. Because the first 18 verses are not a scene, nothing happens in them, nobody speaks. It is a poem, and it opens by quoting the first 3 words of the Hebrew Bible. In the beginning. Every Jewish listener in the 1st century knows that phrase the way you know the opening notes of a national anthem. Genesis. Creation. Darkness on the water. But John changes the second half of the sentence. In the beginning was the Word. The Greek is logos, and it is a word with 2 histories running side by side, which is exactly why he chose it. To a Greek-educated reader, logos meant the rational principle holding the universe together, the reason inside things, the logic of the cosmos. To a Jewish reader, it meant something else. God speaks and the world exists. Let there be light. The word of the Lord came to the prophet. God's speech is how God acts. It goes out, it does work, it comes back. It is not a sound, it is an agent. John takes both meanings, welds them together, and then says the thing that breaks the frame. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. With God, and also was God. He does not soften it or explain it. He states it in the first sentence and moves on. Then, 14 verses in, the poem does something no Greek philosopher would ever have written. The Word became flesh. Not appeared as flesh, not disguised itself, became. The organizing reason of the universe acquired a body that could get tired and bleed. And the next verb is stranger still. Most translations say he dwelt among us. The Greek verb underneath it means he pitched his tent. It is the word for the tabernacle. The portable tent in the wilderness, where the glory of God came down and camped in the middle of the camp. So the claim is not merely that God visited, it is that the tent went up again. The presence moved back into the neighborhood, and we beheld his glory. We looked at it. Not a theory, a face somebody remembered. Now, here is why the prologue matters for everything that follows. It tells you the ending on page 1. Before a single character appears, you already know who this man is. The people inside the story do not. They spend 21 chapters guessing. That gap is the engine of the whole book. It is called dramatic irony, and John runs on it the way other Gospels run on suspense. People will say, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And you, the reader, are sitting there holding the answer they have not got. The prologue also ends with a line that quietly aims at the rest of the Bible. No one has ever seen God at any time. Not Abraham, not Moses, who was told he could only see the back. The Son, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. So John's opening argument is, you've been reading about a God nobody could look at. Now look. Then the poem stops, and the book begins. And once it begins, it has a shape you can see from a distance. Scholars usually cut it into 4 parts, and the labels are theirs, not John's. There are no headings in the manuscripts. Part 1 is the prologue we just read. Chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. Part 2 runs from chapter 1, verse 19, to the end of chapter 12. It is usually called the Book of Signs. Part 3 runs from chapter 13 to the end of chapter 20. The Book of Glory, the Last Supper, the Arrest, the Cross, the Empty Tomb. And Part 4 is chapter 21 on its own, the Epilogue. We will come back to why it stands apart, because that is the strangest thing in the book. The 2 halves are almost exactly balanced in length. And they are not 2 topics. They are a setup and a payoff. The first half is a public argument, conducted in daylight, in front of crowds, and it is lost. The second half is private, a rented upstairs room, a garden, a courtyard, a hill, and a handful of people, and it is won. The hinge between them is a single sentence near the end of chapter 12, and it is one of the saddest lines in the New Testament. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him. That is the verdict on the first half. Signs. Hold on to that word, because it is the single most important vocabulary choice in this entire gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a normal Greek word for a miracle. Dynamis. A mighty work. An act of power. It is where we get the word dynamite. They use it constantly. Jesus could do no mighty work there. The mighty works done in Chorazin. It is their standard term. John never uses it. Not once in 21 chapters. The word for a miracle as an act of raw power is simply absent from his vocabulary. He uses a different word instead. Semeion. Sign. And a sign is a very specific kind of object. A sign is not the thing. A sign is a board by the roadside with an arrow on it. Its entire value is that it points away from itself. If you stop at the sign and admire the sign, you have misused it. You were supposed to look where it pointed and keep walking. So John is not telling you Jesus was powerful. He assumes that. He is telling you every miracle is an arrow and he wants you to follow it. Now, most people will tell you there are 7 signs in John, and there is something honest we should say about that number. John numbers exactly 2 of them. He calls the wedding at Cana the first of his signs. He calls the healing at Capernaum the second. And then he stops counting. He never says third. He never says 7th. He never gives a list. The 7 is a scholarly reconstruction. A very old and very good one, but ours, not his. Which is why different scholars produce slightly different 7s. The disputed one is the walking on the water, because John never calls it a sign, no crowd sees it, and nobody argues about it afterwards. So treat 7 as a useful map, not a label John printed, and then walk them. Sign 1. A wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the wine runs out. Which sounds trivial until you know what running out of wine meant. A village wedding could run a week. The host's whole reputation was inside it. Running dry was a public humiliation people remembered for years. And look at what he uses. 6 stone water jars, standing there for the Jewish rites of purification, 20 or 30 gallons each. That is 150 gallons of ritual washing water. The old system, sitting in the corner, doing its job. He has it filled to the brim, and it comes out as wine. Better wine than what they started with. The steward complains that the order is wrong. You serve the good wine first, when people can still taste it. Nobody saves the best for last. Which is, of course, exactly the point being made. Sign 2. An official from Herod's court comes down from Capernaum. His son is dying. He begs Jesus to come with him. Jesus does not go. He says the boy will live, and the man walks home on nothing but that sentence. A 20-mile walk. His servants meet him on the road with the news, and he asks what hour the fever broke. It was the hour Jesus spoke. The sign is deliberately built to have no visible mechanism, nothing to watch, just a word, a distance, and a man who decided to start walking. Before the third sign, John does something structural. He puts 2 conversations side by side, and they are designed to be read as a matched pair. The first is a man named Nicodemus, a Pharisee, a member of the ruling council, an insider with every credential Jerusalem could issue. He comes to Jesus at night. John says so twice more later, as if the time of day were part of the man's name. And Jesus tells him, nobody can see the kingdom of God unless he is born anothen, which is a word with a deliberate double edge. It can mean again, and it can mean from above. Everywhere else John uses it, it means from above. Nicodemus hears again and gets stuck on the biology. How can a man be born when he is old? That misunderstanding is the mechanism of the entire gospel. Somebody takes him literally, and the literal reading is the wrong one. And it is in this conversation that the most quoted sentence on earth sits. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Now turn the page, because the very next chapter is that scene's mirror, built point for point in the opposite direction. A woman at a well in Samaria, not a leader, not a Jew, not a man, and not respectable. She has had 5 husbands and is living with someone else. And she comes not at night, but at the 6th hour, noon. The hottest, most exposed hour of the day, which usually meant avoiding the other women. Nicodemus arrives with everything and leaves confused. She arrives with nothing and ends up running back to town to tell everyone. And she gets something Nicodemus never does. When she says she knows Messiah is coming, Jesus answers with the bare "I am." The first time in the book he says it that way. He gives it, unattached and unexplained, to a foreign woman by a well at midday. John's arrangement of these 2 chapters is an argument, and it is not subtle. Sign 3. A pool in Jerusalem called Bethesda, with 5 covered colonnades, where the sick lay waiting. And here is one of those honest notes. If you read this chapter in an older translation, there is a verse about an angel stirring the water. That verse is missing from the earliest copies we have, from the great 3rd and 4th century manuscripts. It is a later explanatory note that got copied into the text. Most modern Bibles now print it in a footnote. Nothing in the story depends on it. The man is still there, on his mat, for 38 years, and Jesus asks him a question that sounds almost cruel. Do you want to be healed? After 38 years, that is not a rhetorical question. He heals him and tells him to pick up his mat and walk, which is work, on a Sabbath. And that is where the war starts. From chapter 5 onward, the authorities are not confused by him. They are trying to kill him. And John tells us the reason in plain words. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. They understood him perfectly. Sign 4. 5,000 men on a hillside, 5 barley loaves, 2 fish, and 12 baskets left over. It is the only miracle that appears in all four Gospels. But only John tells you what happened next, and it is the ugly part. The crowd tries to take him by force and make him king. He walks off into the hills alone to stop them. Then he explains the bread, and the explanation empties the room. He tells them they are chasing him because they ate, not because they saw. And by the end of that chapter, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. John reports the desertion without cushioning it. Peter is left saying the least triumphant sentence of loyalty ever recorded. Lord, to whom shall we go? Sign 5, the disputed one. A storm on the lake at night, and he comes to them walking on the water. No crowd, no aftermath, no argument. It happens in the dark to the people who were already following him. A private sign, if it is one at all. Sign 6. A man born blind. And chapter 9 is, sentence for sentence, the best constructed scene in the gospel. Watch how it is engineered. The healed man is interrogated, then interrogated again, then his parents are dragged in, then he is interrogated a third time. And as the questions get longer and more official, his answers get shorter and braver. He starts with, the man called Jesus. Then he is a prophet. Then he begins mocking them. Do you also want to become his disciples? They throw him out of the synagogue. It is a man's spine growing in real time. Meanwhile, the men with the theological training go blind by degrees. That is the whole chapter, and it is a joke with a knife in it. Sign 7. Lazarus. 4 days in the tomb, which mattered because a common belief held the soul lingered near the body 3 days and then left. 4 days means finished. Not a coma, not a mistake. John even has Martha object about the smell. He wants no ambiguity at all. And before the tomb opens, the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept, which is theologically enormous. The Word who made everything is standing at a grave in a small village, crying, minutes before he fixes it. He is not crying because the situation is hopeless. He is crying because it is awful. Those are different, and this book insists on both. And then the sign that raises a dead man is the sign that gets Jesus killed. That is John's cruelest structural joke. The council meets in a panic. If everyone follows him, Rome comes and takes away our place and our nation. It is a political calculation. And Caiaphas, the high priest, says it out loud. It is better for you that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He means it as cold arithmetic. John reports it as accidental prophecy. The man says the truest sentence in the chapter without believing a word of it. 7 signs, and the score at the end of them is that line from chapter 12. So many signs, and they still did not believe. Which tells you John's real opinion of miracles. They are evidence. And evidence does not make anyone believe anything they have decided not to. Running alongside the signs is the other famous pattern in this book, the I am sayings. 7 of them have something attached. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. Each one is an image being taken over. Bread, light, a gate, a shepherd, a vine. Every single one of them is already a picture Israel used for God. The Lord is my shepherd. Israel is God's vine. Your word is a lamp to my feet. He is not inventing metaphors. He is claiming them. But underneath those 7, there is a second set, and this is where the temperature changes. Sometimes he says, I am, and attaches nothing at all. No bread, no light. Just the 2 words, standing there in Greek with nothing after them. Ego eimi. And in the Greek Old Testament, those two words carry a history. They are how God answers Moses at the burning bush. They run all through the second half of Isaiah, where God repeatedly says, in effect, I am He, and there is no other. So when Jesus says it bare, first-century ears do not hear a grammar quirk. And John gives us the proof in chapter 8. He is arguing about Abraham, and he says, before Abraham was, I am, not I was. Before a man dead 19 centuries existed, present tense, the reaction is the commentary. They picked up stones to throw at him. Nobody stones a man for bad verb tenses, and the last of these lands in the dark, in a garden, at the arrest. The soldiers say they are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He says, I am, and John writes that they drew back and fell to the ground. The arresting party goes down first. It is one of the most quietly outrageous stage directions in the Bible. Nobody takes him. He hands himself over after they get up. Which brings us across the hinge into the second half. And the second half slows down almost to a stop. Chapters 1 to 12 cover perhaps 3 years. We know it is roughly 3 because John counts Passovers, and there are 3 of them. That is worth a moment. Read only Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you could reasonably think the ministry lasted about a year. The traditional 3-year ministry that everybody repeats comes almost entirely from John's calendar. It is his contribution to the timeline. Now, watch the gears change. 3 years in 12 chapters. Then 5 whole chapters on a single evening in a single room. That evening is chapter 13 through chapter 17, and there is nothing else like it in the Gospels. It opens with the meal. And the meal is where John's omission becomes deafening. The other 3 all record it. He took bread, broke it, said, "This is my body." This cup is the new covenant, the words the church has repeated ever since. John, who has more room than anyone, does not include them. Instead, he gives you something the others left out entirely. Jesus gets up from the table, takes off his outer clothes, ties a towel around his waist, pours water into a basin, and starts washing feet. This is not a gesture of humility. It is a job. It was slave work, and specifically the work of the lowest slave in a household. Feet in a world of sandals and animals and unpaved streets. It was the task nobody wanted and nobody thanked you for. Peter refuses. Of course he does. And Jesus tells him that if he will not accept it, he has no part with him. And Judas is still in the room. His feet get washed too. John is very clear about the order of events. Then Judas leaves, and John adds 4 words that are also a weather report and a verdict. And it was night. What follows, from the middle of 13 to the end of 17, is called the farewell discourse. The washing is the preface. The discourse proper begins once Judas is gone. And it is not a sermon. It is closer to what people say at a hospital bedside when everyone knows and nobody says. He gives them a new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. By this everyone will know you are mine. Not by doctrine, not by the building, by whether they can stand each other, which is a much harder test and a much easier one to fail. In chapter 14, he says he is going to prepare a place, and that in his Father's house are many rooms. Thomas asks how they can know the way, and gets the 6th, I am. I am the way, and the truth, and the life. And then he promises something they cannot possibly want. He says it is to their advantage that he goes away, because he is sending another helper. The Greek word is parakletos, one called alongside. Advocate, counsel for the defense, the one who stands next to you. He promises this helper 4 separate times across these chapters. It is the most sustained teaching about the Spirit in any gospel. Chapter 15 gives the last of the 7 images. I am the true vine, you are the branches. Abide in me. And the vine is chosen with precision, because in the prophets, Israel is the vine that failed. He is saying, the vine is being replanted, and it is me. Chapter 16 turns cold. He tells them the world will hate them, that they will be expelled from synagogues, that people will think killing them is a service to God. Many scholars hear the community that produced this gospel in that line. People who had been thrown out of their own congregations for what they believed. And then chapter 17, where he stops talking to them and starts talking to his Father out loud in front of them. It is the longest prayer of Jesus recorded anywhere in the Gospels, and a large part of it is not about him at all. He prays for the people in the room. Then he prays for everyone who will believe because of what they say, which is a prayer with your name in it. And what he asks for is not their success or their safety. He asks that they may be one. That is the request. Then they walk out into the dark, and the arrest happens, and everything speeds up again. Now we have to deal with the clock. Because John's timing of the crucifixion does not match the other three, and pretending otherwise helps nobody. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper is a Passover meal. They say so directly. He is arrested that night and crucified the following day. In John, the meal is before the Passover festival. And on the morning of the trial, John gives us a detail that cannot be smoothed over. The accusers will not walk into the Roman governor's headquarters, because entering a Gentile building would defile them, and they still have to eat the Passover. So in John, the Passover meal has not happened yet while Jesus is standing trial, and John pins it down again at the sentencing. It was the day of preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour, around midday. The exact window when lambs were being killed in the temple, which means John's Jesus dies at the hour of the lambs. And that is very obviously the point he is making. Because back in chapter 1, the very first thing anyone says about him in this book is, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." And John closes the loop at the cross. The soldiers break the legs of the other two men to end it faster. They come to Jesus, find him already dead, and do not break his. And John says this happened so the scripture would be fulfilled, not one of his bones will be broken. That line is the instruction for the Passover lamb in the book of Exodus. He has been building this since chapter 1. So what do we do with the disagreement? Honestly, scholars have not settled it, and anyone who tells you it is simple is selling something. Some argue the groups in Jerusalem were on different festival calendars, so both timelines could be literally true at once. Some read John's phrases as ordinary shorthand for the Friday of Passover week, which would remove the conflict entirely. And many conclude that John has arranged his clock for theological reasons, that he is telling you what the death meant by telling you when it happened. What is not honest is to flatten it and pretend the four accounts read the same. They do not. This book has its own clock and its own reasons, and in between, the trial. Pilate asking whether he is a king, Jesus saying his kingdom is not from this world, and Pilate's exit line. What is truth? He asks the question and then walks out of the room without waiting, which may be the most Roman thing in the gospel. That exchange is the exact text on that credit card-sized scrap in Manchester. Of everything John wrote, that is, the piece that survived longest. He dies saying it is finished. One word in Greek, a word used on receipts. Paid. Completed. Nothing outstanding. And the burial is oddly extravagant. Nicodemus, who first came to him at night, arrives with about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. That is a preposterous quantity. That is a royal burial. The man who came in the dark is the one who shows up in daylight with the spices. Then the tomb. Mary Magdalene first in the dark. Peter and the other disciple running, and John carefully noting who ran faster. Mary mistakes him for the gardener, which, in a book that opened with a creation poem, is not a throwaway detail. A garden, and a new one starting in it. Thomas gets his 8 days of doubt and his invitation to touch the wounds, and answers with the highest confession in the book, "My Lord and my God," which lands exactly where the prologue started. The Word was God. 200 pages later, a skeptic says it out loud. And then John does the thing no other gospel does. He stops and explains himself. Jesus did many other signs, he says, which are not written in this book. He admits he selected. He admits things were left out. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. That is a purpose statement. That is a closing paragraph. It says this book. It is unmistakably an ending. And then chapter 21 begins anyway. 7 disciples go fishing and catch nothing. A man on the shore tells them to try the other side. The net comes up with 153 fish. And on the beach, there is a charcoal fire. The Greek word for a charcoal fire appears exactly twice in the entire New Testament, both times in this book. The first time was in the courtyard, where Peter stood warming his hands and denied knowing him 3 times. Now the same fire, the same smell, and 3 questions. "Do you love me?" asked 3 times, until Peter is hurt by the 3rd one. 3 denials, 3 questions, 3 commissions. Feed my sheep. He is not forgiven in the abstract. He is put back to work. And then the last paragraph tells you something about who assembled this book. This is the disciple who is bearing witness, it says, and we know that his testimony is true. We know. Suddenly, there is a we in the room. Someone other than the witness is writing the final endorsement. So the most natural reading of this gospel is that it ends at 20, and that a community who possessed it added a final chapter and signed it. Not a forgery. A colophon. The people who preserved the testimony, standing up at the end and vouching for the man who gave it. And that brings us to the other honest note, which is the most famous story in this gospel that probably was not in this gospel. The woman caught in adultery, the crowd with stones. Let him who is without sin cast the first one. Everyone leaves, oldest first. It is missing from our earliest and best copies. It is absent from the great papyri of around the year 200, and from the 2 great 4th century codices. The earliest surviving Greek manuscript that contains it is from the 5th century, and in the copies that do have it, it will not sit still. Some families of manuscripts put it after chapter 7 verse 36. Some park it at the very end, after chapter 21. One group moves it into Luke entirely. A passage that floats between 2 different Gospels is a passage that entered the tradition late. That is what the Wandering tells you. And yet, Jerome, around the year 417, says it was in many Greek and Latin copies he knew. It was clearly old and clearly loved. Augustine even suggested that nervous copyists cut it out on purpose, afraid it made forgiving adultery look too easy. So the careful position, held by a great many believing scholars, is this: it very likely did not come from John's pen, and it may well be a true memory of Jesus. Those 2 statements are not in conflict. Your Bible probably brackets it or footnotes it, and that footnote is not an attack. It is the translators being honest with you, which is, in a strange way, the right note to end on. Because this is the gospel that keeps telling you what it is doing. It tells you it's selected. It tells you why. It tells you who is vouching for it. It admits the world could not hold the books if everything were written down. So read it the way it asks to be read. Not as a quarry for single verses, but front to back, in one sitting, watching the arrows. A poem about the beginning. 7 arrows pointing at one man. A room, a basin, and a long goodbye. A trial at midday while the lambs are dying. An empty tomb, a purpose statement, and then a breakfast on a beach that nobody had to add. And somewhere behind all of it, a scrap of papyrus the size of a credit card, with a governor's question still legible on it after 1900 years. What is truth? He walked out before the answer. The whole book is written on the assumption that the answer was standing in front of him,